Okay, and then do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, well, hi everyone. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. Rejoining me tonight in our All Things Latin America edition, and hopefully if we have time, other topics, is Joe Emersberger, who's a Canadian media critic and NGO critic, leftist activist, and an important anti-imperialist voice. He's a frequent contributor to ZNet, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which is America's leading media critic organization. And yes, he's my guest to discuss what's been going on in Latin America. It's been a while since I've covered it, and who better than to have Joe on to talk about that. So, Joe, first off, thanks for coming back on the program. And I also forgot to mention you are also the co-author with the other brilliant media critic, NGO critic, and superb historian Justin Poder, a fantastic book on Venezuela. And what's the title of that book? Remind us so that people can get a copy.
Extraordinary Threat: the U.S. Empire, the media, and 20 years of coup attempts in Venezuela.
Fantastic. And I still have to get my copy, so apologies in advance for that. All right, so let's get underway. So, Joe, can you talk to us about what has been going on in Ecuador since Lenin Moreno literally threw Julian Assange to the piranhas of British and American imperialism, his pivot to the economic right, and then there was lawfare that was unleashed against popular leftist President Rafael Correa, who is de facto in exile here in Belgium, where I live. But he's in Brussels, and then also talk to us about the rise of the bankster Guillermo Lasso, and then so talk about that. And then my follow-up question to all of that is what has been going on now in Ecuador under Lasso.
Okay, well, real quickly, 10 years. Rafael Correa took office in 2007. He was in office until he won many elections, until 2017. He left office. Under his 10 years in office, he rewrote there was a constituent assembly elected to rewrite the Constitution, and that Constitution came into effect in 2008. And during his 10 years in office, there was a massive reduction in poverty. It was like 48% reduction in poverty. There was a 2/3 reduction in the homicide rate, which is unprecedented in Ecuador's history for the past 50, 60 years. I mean, since the 1980s, the homicide rate had been continually on the rise, steadily increasing, all the way until the early years of Correa's government. He implemented a tremendous, with the Constitutional Assembly, everything he did. They also made sweeping reforms to the legal system, to the way police were selected. Plus, there were economic policies, a whole slew of things. But the upshot is that it drastically reduced violent crime. Homicide rate fell by 2/3. It was an unprecedented decrease. And since he left office, it's shot back up to its highest point ever since 1980. It's more than quadrupled since he left office in 2017. It is now the major factor that's plaguing Ecuadorians. It is the major concern because people just don't feel safe anymore. And so that's been the result of right-wing governments that have taken over since 2017. Lenin Moreno, who you mentioned, he won the election in 2017 by campaigning as a staunch Correa loyalist. So he turned around literally within weeks. I mean, when you mentioned that he threw Assange out of the embassy, that was in 2019. That was 2 years into his 4-year term. But he turned immediately against Correa within weeks of being inaugurated. He turned viciously against Correa, trashed everything, and basically governed exactly the way his right-wing opponent that year, 2017, was Guillermo Lasso. So when Guillermo Lasso won in 2021, that election, it was as if he was winning a second term for himself, because that's how far right Lenin Moreno was for his whole 4 years. Like I said, it was within weeks of taking office. It was like he flicked a switch. It went from praising Correa, saying he was literally saying he was the greatest president ever, and so on, and then turning completely 180 degrees around and saying the exact opposite. And that's how he carried on for the next 4 years. And now you said Correa actually does have political asylum in Belgium because the cases that have been cooked up against him have been so preposterous that, I mean, really, they're a joke. So, but he's been disqualified, similar to what happened with Lula in Brazil. He's been disqualified from running for office. He would be arrested if he came back to Ecuador as things stand right now. They've imprisoned other key people in his movement. Jorge Glass was in jail. His former vice president was in jail for 5 years, and are threatening to put him in again because he got released, so now they're threatening to throw him back in. But, you know, the king was, in addition to persecuting Correa's movement and everything, at the same time as they just created this monstrous catastrophe in Ecuador. So their credibility is so low that's now, even though Correa is not running, the people allied with his movement, Luisa Gonzalez is the presidential candidate, Andrés Arauz is the VP, the vice presidential candidate, and they have an excellent chance of winning, hopefully in the first round this time when the elections are held in August 20th. And you know that because in February there were local elections all over the country, and Correa's movement by far carried the most, won the most mayor's offices and governorships, and I mean, it's really astounding because this is a movement that's been tremendously persecuted. They were not even allowed to form officially their own political party until like 2021, I believe. They were finally, after the last election, they were finally allowed to kind of have their own party. They had to like attach themselves to other parties to be able to legally run in 2021 at all for anything. And so and again, the key thing here is that the right-wing governments since 2017 have just created such an incredible fiasco, especially with violent crime. But they've also increased poverty. They had a horrendous pandemic response. It was for into the pandemic. Several months into the pandemic, Ecuador was leading the world as one of the worst pandemic responses in terms of deaths per capita. And that's according to outlets like the Financial Times, which are very partial to governments like Ecuador's. So I mean, when they're even saying, "Wow, they're really doing terrible," they're doing terrible. It's just the tremendous incompetence, the greed, and just the only thing they've done aggressively is try to persecute Correa's movement. But everything else they left collapse, and so that's destroyed their credibility. If they had even just maintained decent living standards. People with all the media support they have, people might be inclined to believe a lot of what they say about Correa, but not because it's good, but just because people it's very, if you throw a ton of allegations at somebody, I mean, who has the time to look through all the details? And if everybody is saying the same thing, it kind of becomes difficult for the average person. You're really going to dig into it. You're going to have doubts, even if you don't believe it, but you'll have doubts. It'll be effective. But they've destroyed their credibility so much that is not effective anymore, and it looks like Correa's movement is very well positioned, hopefully, to come back into the presidency.
I have to ask this follow-up question then, which is so when Lenin Moreno lost the election against Guillermo Lasso because
he won the election. Lenin Moreno won the election against Guillermo Lasso in 2017. He won the election by running as a Correa loyalist. Now, as soon as he took office, as soon as he won the election, it was obvious he just turned completely against Correa and became basically Lasso might as well have won. He may as well have won the election. That's how completely Lenin Moreno turned around.
But then, so when he finished his first term, Lenin Moreno, that's when the electorates.
Yeah, he didn't run for re-election. He was too unpopular. Okay, he didn't try. He had single digit level support according to some polls. He was monstrously unpopular. Guillermo Lasso won by like 5 points in the second round of that election over Andrés Arauz, the Correa's candidate. But if you think about the amount of persecution they've been suffering, they still did extremely well. But I think Arauz is there. It gets to be a long story. But I think at that time things were bad, but I think that things were still not bad enough that that they could overcome the persecution. And I think Arauz's campaign also made mistakes in the second round. After they didn't win, they won the first round, but not by enough to win outright. And so in the second round, they kind of did a change of strategy where Arauz kind of tried to distance himself from Correa to try to have a wider appeal. And it turned out, I mean, whatever, it's easy to say in hindsight, but I mean, the truth is, with hindsight, you can say it just that strategy did not work. I think what they ended up doing, instead of differentiating himself from widening his appeal, he kind of just started to remind people of Moreno. So because he was like, wait a second, you know what I mean? So it became a bad tactic that his campaign tried. And I think in my opinion, I think that's what cost them the election. In retrospect, I mean, it's a tough call. I don't think it was a smart thing to do. And I think this time around, things are so much worse now. I don't see. I mean, I watched Luisa Maldonado's interviews and stuff, and she is 100% message clarity. We made Ecuador safe. We did good things. We're going to do it again. Like running on Correa's record, 100%, no wavering, and that's key. I think they have to. If for whatever reason they don't win in the first round, I hope they don't make the same mistake again in trying to somehow broaden their appeal or do. They got to stick with message clarity. Frankly, I think they have a good chance of winning. I mean, you never know. I mean, anything can happen, but I think they have an excellent chance of winning this time because just things, even in 2 years under Lasso, they've gotten just dramatically worse, even worse than they already were.
Is Marino has he been kicked out of that of the left party that Correa founded, or like what's been going on with him since he opted not to run for office again?
Okay, all right. Correa, as soon as Moreno took over and did this betrayal of Correa. What Moreno did was he basically seized control of the party. The party actually tried to throw Moreno out, but Moreno was just with the control he had of the legal system, the support in the media. He was in the electoral authorities. They did illegally did a whole sweeping change of everything without even electing a constitutional assembly. He just appointed people who made these sweeping changes to the judiciary, to the prosecutors, to the regulators, to the electoral authorities. He did a clean sweep without even doing a constituent assembly. And the media around the world just applauded this. It was just a major power grab. So by doing that, he was able to basically just seize control of the party. And so the Correas just said, okay, this is not worth fighting for anymore. We're just going to try to form another party, just form a new party, right? And they weren't able to do that because there was so much, everything was so rigged against them. They had to basically try to borrow, just get inside other parties, a few other parties, let them campaign under their banner to be able to just participate in elections at all. And it wasn't until 2021 that they actually finally got their own party registered because there was so much obstructionism. It was all designed basically to try to leave them without a voice. And that's aside from throwing people in jail and throwing people in exile and everything else. There was also all sorts of legal shenanigans going on. So in that sense, they're somewhat better positioned this time around as well. They actually have their own party to run under again. So.
And but aren't elections delayed because Guillermo Lasso declared some state of emergency and now he's basically put the brakes on upcoming elections and whatnot?
Okay, no, this is what happened. Hang on one sec.
No problem.
Okay. All right. Under Ecuador's 2008 constitution, the president has a kind of a wide latitude under the Constitution article. I can't remember the exact article. I'm going to say 140 something. I can't remember off the top of my head the article, but basically it gives him the right to dissolve the National Assembly. Okay, to say, okay, your terms are over, and my term is over as well, and we're going to go to elections. I can run to finish off my term. And you guys can all run to finish off your term. So the president and the National Assembly, they have fresh elections for both. And the president who does this is entitled to run if he wants to as well. So Lasso could have run, but he didn't run because he's too unpopular. Even after 2 years, his popularity plummeted so far. He didn't, like Moreno, he just didn't even bother to try. Okay, so but the Constitution allows him to do that. It allows him to, but they have to go to snap elections, and not just for the presidency, but also for the entire National Assembly. And the Constitution, different article, it allows the National Assembly to also end the president's cut short the president's term, but when they do that, they also have to cut short their own, and they both have to go to snap elections to finish off the 2 years that's left in the term. And they can only use this once per 4-year electoral term. Okay, so this mechanism exists, and he invoked it. Now, the danger about the constitutionally questionable nature of it is because he was actually undergoing impeachment proceedings. Because impeachment proceedings were underway, there was an argument that it was unconstitutional. This measure should not be able to be invoked while there's an actual impeachment process that's been approved, voted for, and underway. Right? So there was an argument about that. But at the end of the day, I think compared to what's been going on in the past 6 years, it's really not. It's not as big a deal as what they've been doing. I mean, they did so much unconstitutional stuff over the past 6 years that I think actually it's better that he did this. It fractured the kind of right-wing unity. A lot of people on the right did not want this, but he was so unpopular. Things are such a mess that he was kind of, to save himself, I think he did this to give himself an escape hatch, to give himself time to leave, because until the elections are held, he can issue decrees. Supposedly the Constitutional Court is supposed to act on a check on it because there's no National Assembly during this interim period until the elections. So he can issue decrees that are supposed to have to be of an emergency nature. But the Constitutional Court, they're the ones who are supposed to control whether these emergencies are actually valid or not, right? But the problem is that the entire Constitutional Court was fired and replaced by Moreno in 2018. So this is a Constitutional Court that's not exactly to be trusted to act as an effective check on a right-wing president, because it was already set up to be his rubber stamp. Even with that, he's still complaining that the Constitutional Court isn't giving him enough leeway, but that's another issue. But so that's what happened. So that's why we're having snap elections. It was such a, like I said, a spiraling out of control crisis with violent crime. I mentioned elections in February. He tried to pass some very reactionary proposals to deal with the violent crime, because it's like the right wing, they create a violent crime problem, and then their solution is stuff like give everybody guns, allow the United States to extradite people. You know, the typical right wing solution, right? They want to just basically take advantage of a crisis they create to grab more power for the police, for arbitrary measures that, you know.
And ironically, they're so obsessed with law and order, and hey, who doesn't want law and order? But you know, instead of approaching it, because obviously poverty creates, you know, crime, and instead of, you know, tackling it with social justice measures, instead of attacking with social justice measures, it's like, it's why don't we all have like vigilantes? Why don't we just like flood the streets with like more guns? Why don't we give everybody like, you know, a Second Amendment and this kind of, you know, like, part of my language, kind of like retarded Bolsonaro approach. And
well, and the thing is too, remember, he put these to a referendum, so, and the Carrists were able to defeat it, partly because he's so unpopular, but one reason they were able to defeat it, say, look, we reduced violent crime dramatically while we were in office. We didn't do any of that. We didn't have mass incarceration. We didn't make guns easier to get. You know, we solved the problem without doing any of that. So why should you vote for proposals that an unpopular president is trying to ram through, which aren't going to, because they had good arguments because of that track record. That is a huge weapon, but they have to use it. Their track record in office reducing violent crime is extraordinary, and they have to use it. You know, yes, poverty reduces violent crime, but it's not enough. I mean, in Venezuela under Chavez, they were making great progress in poverty reduction for a lot of years, but they still had an increasing problem with violent crime because they weren't bold enough, in my opinion, taking control of the judiciary, contrary to all this stuff that Chavez was rigging the judiciary. It's exactly actually the opposite. He left. He did not make bold enough moves to reorder the legal system, the judiciary, it turned out later where they realized they had a lot of opportunities like Moreno type people among Chavista ranks as prosecutors and stuff like that. So that was also another problem. So it's poverty reduction helps, but it also has to go along with getting control, making sure the judiciary and the prosecutors and the police. Like one thing that Correa implemented that was very unpopular with police. I mean, he had a police uprising against him in 2010, but he instituted polygraph tests, strict tests, where they could ask you, you're interviewing for police, and they'll have you hook you up to a polygraph. Say, would you take a bribe? Do you know anybody who's taken a bribe? Are you linked with any businesses that are doing illegal stuff? The questions like that to really clean up the police. They fit with that.
Wow, interesting.
They vetted they shouldn't say vetted. They discarded like a third of the applicants at one point, something like that. Like a large number of people just didn't clear that hurdle. Just could not clear that hurdle because so they did a lot of basic common sense stuff. So it's more than just poverty. There has to be other approaches as well. Poverty is important. Like the Correists are focusing on poverty. They're making that point, but it has to go along with a holistic approach, to work.
That's fascinating, and folks should take notes of all of this, especially the Western left when it comes to trying to overcome a very hostile media environment. Because I think because everybody keeps forgetting, I believe that from Hugo Chavez to Lula to Delma to the Kirchners and to even Correa, they all won their elections despite of an overwhelmingly hostile media from the corporate media, from even the states media, right?
Right.
Starting recording. Gavinovic. Yeah, all good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to 1+1, and we are rejoined by Joe Emersberger, and we're talking about Latin American affairs. So, Joe, before we, So continuing on with what we were talking about, I was, mentioning that, all the Latin American heads of all the left-wing Latin American heads of states. It could be the Kirchners, it could be Lula, it could be Delma, it could be Hugo Chavez, it could be Rafael Correa. We always keep forgetting, the Western audiences always keeps forgetting that despite these people and their movements which get elected, they have to deal with a very, very hostile media environment from the corporate media outlets, both in television and radio and, in the magazines, the newspapers and whatnot, with also the state media. So even though, yes, the head of state gets to choose, who runs whatever state media company, but it doesn't change the fact that the bureaucracy and the legacy of one right, of one right wing, the right wing folks, that dominate even state media. It's a lot to try to, dismantle and to overcome. And when you're trying to fight under the rules of a democracy or a plutocracy, which is much of Latin America, so even state media will be hostile towards an AMLO and Evo Morales, even if they've been in power for over 5 years or 10 years, correct? Or
well, I can't speak to Mexico. Ecuador state media really didn't exist under Correa. So when Correa came in, he basically created the state media from scratch. They could have problems now because of what they've done to state media, but they've also shrunk it too. So I like Chavez also amplified, expanded state media. Their problem was more the entrenchment of the bureaucracy, of the right wing bureaucracy in the apparatus of the state. The prosecutors, the judiciary, the police at different levels, some sectors of the military. That's more the danger that in Ecuador they'll have to confront that again. They've all the reforms they've done to the police have been undone. The police are now widely seen as often too much part of the problem with violent crime. So there's going to be an issue there. But that's the state media. I mean, and one other difference with 2021, things have gotten so much worse now. In 2021, the Correists were still cautious about calling for another constituent assembly. The line in 2021 was, "We don't discard the idea." Okay, that was the idea. Well, it's possible we could do it, because now it's much more forceful and clear. It's no, we need a constituent assembly.
Because they're afraid of the perception that if they keep proposing and even enacting more reforms, more constituent assemblies, that the very hostile corporate state media, which is overwhelmingly right wing, will depict this as the communists are taking over and all that stuff. Or
but it's no. Remember, a constituent assembly is elected. So if you elected under a situation where the right could get into the constituent assembly, it could conceivably could go backwards instead of forwards, right? Because it's not like the right wing's allowed to participate in the constituent assembly elections. So yeah, so in 2021, the Correists were still cautious about that. Given the media, like you said, the media environment and everything else, they were still cautious about going with that idea. Now they're saying, no, we need a constituent assembly. We need to go to a constituent assembly to reorder, to basically undo this mess. Like I said, they fired the entire Supreme Court, Constitutional Court. They fired and replaced them under Moreno. Moreno did that. Without a constituent assembly election at all, he just did it. He just appointed people to do it, to reorder the entire legal system, right, and regulatory system, and electoral system. So, it's just a humongous mess, and they're going to have to. And they want to fix the problems by using the same technique they used in 2008. 2008, where they had the is to elect a constituent assembly, to have the legitimacy to go forward and make changes that need to be made to deal with all this catastrophe that Ecuador is living through now.
We're going to, if we do have time, I would like to return to how we have. What's the best way forward to have a much more democratic, accurate media and stuff like that. But here's hoping that the People Power movements make a huge comeback in Ecuador, and we'll have to have you back on the program to talk about that. While I still have you here, I'm curious if you can enlighten me and the audience on what's going on in Argentina, because didn't a bunch of right-wing judges bar Cristina Kirchner from running for office, and isn't she even threatened with going to jail? I'm wondering if you can enlighten us about that.
I haven't followed her case, so I can't. I know they've definitely tried to disqualify her, but she did run as vice president for Fernandez, right? So, but there have been. I mean, she was victim of an assassination attempt. I mean, it looks like the guy's gun just jammed, fortunately, or she would have been murdered right there. So there's definitely a judiciary in Argentina that's obviously a big problem, and it hasn't been dealt with. But since
the end of the U.S. Canadian Anglo-backed right-wing junta, which overthrew Isabel Perón and then launched this reign of terror known as the Dirty Woods.
Correct. So there's issues there that haven't been dealt with. There's issues in Brazil that haven't been dealt with. Because if you think about it, who are the countries that had a constituent assembly refound the state? It was Bolivia, it was Ecuador, and it was Venezuela. Now, even with doing that, what happened in Bolivia? There was still a coup. I mean, there was almost a year of a right-wing dictatorship backed by the United States. That, despite everything that Morales had done well, they were still able to violently seize power. With the help of the OAS and the private media in Bolivia, etc. So it's still a huge challenge. You can have all these landslide victories and do all these great things. You're still going to have problems. Look at Correa, all the achievements he did, refounding the state, rewriting the Constitution, all that good stuff. But still, they trusted somebody they shouldn't have trusted. And it wasn't just Moreno either. Moreno was obviously the key guy. There were a lot of people underneath him within Correa's movement who either succumbed to the pressure or were simply bought off and became, enemies of the movement that put them in office. So they trusted, it's hard to say. You want to have if you have a movement that's successful, you're going to have to some extent have a broad-based, selection of people inside it. But if you aren't careful and you let insincere people get too close to the power, then they can turn everything around. It's very dangerous. In Venezuela, they were fortunate that Maduro hasn't been that way, right? And they've withstood an incredible, just outrageous amount of aggression from the United States. I mean, just in terms of its economic impact, it's like a war. It's like literally you don't see the kind of destruction imposed by U.S. Economic sabotage and everything. It's like war. It's a hybrid war. I mean, I mean, bombs would be worse, obviously, but the amount of damage they can inflict through economic warfare is just amazing. So it's been very bad, but they've withstood that.
Also doing the same thing in Nicaragua as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then of course there's the problem of which we might get into if we have time, but there's also the problem of our Western leftists who are either reading junk stuff from the NGO world and and then recycling a lot of propaganda, whether it's towards Daniel Ortega or Hugo Chavez or Maduro or Brazil. And that's a perfect segue to this question, which is it's been over 100 days since Lula took office. And just before his inauguration, if memory serves me well, Bolsonaro's fascist cult followers, his basket of deplorables, stormed the Supreme Court and in Congress. And I have to ask, how do you assess Lula's 100 days, and what is the judiciary doing, if anything? What are they doing with those far right forces that that did that huge act of vandalism, storming the courts and Congress?
Yeah, well, Bolsonaro, as you know, has just been disqualified, right, for 15 years based on his corruption allegations and that.
He should be barred. Well, he should be barred for life, and then he should be, in jail for the rest of his life for his epic crimes against humanity and his criminal incompetency.
Well, he's a fascist. I mean, there's no question about it. And his whole election, if you think about it, his whole election victory was illegitimate anyway because Lula was in jail, not allowed to run, and everyone knows that was basically trumped up charges they used against Lula it was basically kind of a legalistic coup that allowed the right to seize power in Brazil. But I assess Lula as a smooth political operator. Obviously, a victory for the left that he's in office. But I mean, he's kind of a mixed bag. He has gone along with the United States and appears to still be going along with their efforts to clamp down on Haiti. And
yes, I wasn't even going to mention that, but so thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, indeed.
So he's a mixed bag in that sense, but he's definitely an ally to he's definitely somebody that we operating within the constraints, right? Brazil's never had like a process where they rewrite the constitution where they can fix a lot of the problems they have. So it's a tough place to operate. So I see him as overall as a positive, but just say I'm not as up on him as I am on Maduro or others. I mean, there's always some who I think are stronger leftists or the stronger position maybe to be better leftists than he is. Petro, frankly, has been a surprise to me. He could be worse, a lot worse. I mean, he's
Oh yes, from Colombia, which at the moment he's been. Talk briefly about the positive stuff he's been doing.
Well,
but I believe he's expressed fear that the right are going to try to do a coup against him. The far right are going to try to do a coup against him, or.
Yes, he's under threat in Colombia from the right, who's totally backed by the United States. But he's also normalized relations with Venezuela. He's not going along with the demonization of Venezuela. Same with Lula. So that's very important because the less the United States can resort to outright aggression. That's so whatever other limitations they might have, at least if they don't go along with that, then there's a greater possibility for the regional integration to happen, and that's huge. I mean, that's ultimately what holds Latin America back, is the inability to have a long-term left-wing presence in office that allows them to unite various countries to work together as a bloc to develop. That's the goal. So they're really going to have to rethink how they can stay in power longer. Because they one thing I could say about Correa is that tremendous amount of strengths in so many ways, but he did early in his time in office kind of buy into the kind of dogmas and platitudes about term limits, and by the time he wanted to change his mind, then they could throw his own words back in his face, and so he was overconfident about the ability of his movement to go forward without him. Movements need strong leaders, trusted leaders, proven leaders. They're not easy to get, and I think the left has to learn from that. All this nonsense about term limits is just that. I think Evo ultimately, that's what they used against him as well. They wanted term limits. That was their way in to one of the ways in to try to discredit him and throw up enough incite their followers and then get the police on board, the military, to overthrow him in 2019. But that's they need to move away from that. Mexico has been they've used term limits religiously for like about a century, and what has it done for them? It's basically entrenched the oligarchy there. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it would be great if they could get away from that, but that's a problem.
Interesting. And actually, before I ask you this question about AMLO, is there anything specifically about Lula that that he's done which we can applaud, in his over 100 days in office now?
No, you look at what he's done.
I mean, socio-domestic policies in Brazil specifically.
I would advise people, if you really want to know the details of what Lula is doing right in terms of domestic policy, I strongly advise people to follow Brian Meyer and Camila Escalante, who've done great reporting. They've Calcetuan News. You can follow them. They've gone into the details more of what's going on in Brazil. So in terms of domestic policy, and geopolitically, you just look at what they're criticizing him for, and it's basically for not echoing Washington on the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine. So that's another positive from Lula there. So there's definitely positive things to we should be happy that he's in office, but there's also Brazil has its limitations, and he has to work around them.
Yes. And also have to plug our friends over at Orinoco Tribune. If people are interested in Latin American affairs, they also should check out that's very criminally underrated outlets. And have to ask this question about AMLO. Now, in the beginning, what's your assessment of AMLO's time in office? Because I think in the beginning, Western cynics and skeptics seem to think that he was going to govern very weakly, but as time has gone by, he's being the socialist reformer we want him to be, and he seems to be pissing off the right people. He seems to be pissing off the right powerful people, and what's his name? There was the ex-president Vicente Fox, who was depicted as this. As this wonderful liberal anti-Trump guy with, we're not going to build your fucking wall and stuff like that. But if anybody, and okay, ha ha ha, he's funny when he does that. But if anybody looks at that guy's track record, the guy is a crook, is a rival oligarch. So. Yes. So for AMLO, how do you assess his time in office?
Well, unfortunately, it's coming to an end, right? I mean, like I say, term limits again. It all depends if I believe the woman who's going to succeed him, whether she can move Mexico forward in a progressive direction. I mean, institutionally they're in quite a straitjacket with term limits there. So I don't, that's the problem. And yeah, I mean, the positive about AMLO that I see again is that he's not gone along with the vilification of Maduro the way the other right-wing governments have. A lot of Ecuadorian politicians are in exile in Mexico. They were exiled in 2019 when there were massive protests against Lenin Moreno at that time, because already by 2019 the disastrous, and this was before the pandemic, his neoliberal policies just really began to hurt people, and they led to major protests. So by that time, and already he drove a bunch of politicians exile, and they went to Mexico, and they found asylum in Mexico. Evo Morales barely escaped with his life during the coup, and he first went to Mexico to seek asylum. So he's been positive in that sense. I haven't followed his domestic policies as closely. I stick mostly trying to follow what's going on in Venezuela and Ecuador, and that keeps pretty busy. But yeah, but he's definitely, I mean, these are generally, they're all different, but they're generally progressive leaders who care about integration, who care about who realize that Latin America needs to be united to stand a chance at developing.
Also seems to me, is it safe to say, it seems to me as if the what we call mild reforms actually mean a heck of a lot in a place like Mexico, in a place like Brazil, in a place like Argentina. So I think a lot of times us in the West, we take a lot of things for granted because our society has shifted so much to the fiscal right, and then on top of that, there's the socially regressive right that attacks, reproductive rights, that attacks, the LGBTQIA plus community, and so forth. And then there's just this level of cynicism when our left institutions, our seemingly left-wing leaders, also pivot to the right or are very weak in holding into account, the Democrats, Labor, NDP, and stuff like that. But it seems to me, I remember, following, Brazilian politics, I definitely was influenced by a lot of the coverage of Western left-leaning outlets, call them independent, call them nonprofit outlets, which all depicted Lula as just another neoliberal, like a Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. He's very, he's very weak. We bought into some of the propaganda that Lula was just another corrupt politician, like all of them, so a pox on their houses. And whatever my criticisms, and both of us, we do have criticisms of Glenn Greenwald, but it seems when Glenn Greenwald was pushing back against, the supposedly popular protests against Lula, or when we started to read outlets, as you mentioned, Brazil Wire, we all realized that actually Lula did a lot of good for the people. Delma did a lot of good for the people. It's just they had to fight literally with two arms tied behind their back. And then I remember, having past guests of mine, Marilava Lima, an English teacher in Sao Paulo, and when she was listing some of the many, accomplishments of Lula, I was just sort of I was just so shocked that I said to her, "Wow, I had no idea that Lula did all these accomplishments," because I've been reading Western English speaking media, and they do not talk about those accomplishments of Lula. So I wanted your thoughts on that, because as you mentioned, when it comes to Evo Morales wanting to run for another election, when it comes to all of those Latin American heads of states who are worried about how some of their actions are going to be perceived in Western corporate media and so forth, that they all seem to be I just want your thoughts on all of that. It's my
Yeah, well, yeah, we got to be very careful of that, because the one when I know a case well, like I'll go back to Korea. There's a lot of left. At one point, Naomi Klein was writing public letters on behalf of some NGO there that was protesting in Korea, um, and he backed away a bit from regulating this NGO based on the pressures he got from outside Ecuador. And in general, like there was a very reactionary candidate in 2021. His name was Yaku Perez. He ran with the under the banner of the Pachakutik Party. Pachakutik is the elected wing of the Kanai movement, which is the largest indigenous federation. So,
Actually, Joe, hold on one second. Yes, we seem to be having some internet connection problems. So, actually, okay, can you try to repeat what you were saying again? And yeah, try to
I hear
repeat
a
what
lot
you were
of
saying
buzzing.
again.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me well? Because I hear a lot of buzzing. You hear me? I hear a lot of buzzing.
Yes. There does seem to be that, and also there seems to be some delay in your.
Okay, now it's better.
Uh,
Now it's better.
okay. Okay. If we do have persistent problems, then we'll just close the video and then continue on doing an audio video. Okay. So, anyways, so you're saying about Naomi Klein, NGOs,
Yeah.
and explain
Like she had criticism. Correct. What they see, people like Klein, they tend to have contacts in the NGO world in countries like Ecuador. So those people will be effectively lobby people like Klein, people on the outside. Yaku Perez, for example, the 2021 candidate, he got some positive press coverage from Western left, some elements of the Western left, and he was a super reactionary person. I mean, he ran under the because there are there's in the indigenous movement, there's a very reactionary segment to them, and they've tended, for whatever reason, to dominate their electoral arm. The Kanai, which is more the social movement organization, the largest indigenous social movement organization, they tend to stage protests against neoliberalism and stuff like that, but they've also have a history of also collaborating with certain right-wing elements as well. They collaborated with Moreno for the early period of his presidency. They were very hostile to Correa, basically from the very beginning, despite all the achievements Correa during his time in office. So there's a certain and these types of leftists who are often for opportunistic reasons against reforms. They tend to have the ear of certain NGOs and Westerners, and then they get amplified. Yeah, so it creates a distorted view, and people get confused, and they start seeing people. They start making criticisms that aren't fair or aren't based in reality, and so forth. And yeah, I think that could have happened to some extent with Lula, and with any president really, but because there's that element in the Western left. In the West, the leftists tend, first of all, not to be in power, so they don't confront the dilemmas of actually having political power. What do you do about the police? How do you enforce the laws? What do you do about people taking the streets with violent protests against you? What do you do? I mean, do you just appeal to slogans, or do you actually do something? Do you actually use the police force, right? They don't have those. They don't have those dilemmas. They're never in power, so it's easy for them to just kind of from their position of powerlessness at home pass judgment on people who actually do have to govern. You know what I mean? So that's an issue. So that could and that's all. So the cases that I know well, that makes me a little bit skeptical, cautious about when I hear criticism of Lula. There are criticisms I make, but I try to be cautious because I know that we have this tendency to vilify, to demonize leaders that are actually in office and working against the Western Empire, and too often on the Western left we end up working against them instead of trying to work against what our own leaders are doing to undermine those governments.
Yeah. And I think if I heard you correctly, can you repeat that again? That point again.
What's that?
That the Western left needs to be very cautious when they engage in this over criticisms of leftists that are in power.
Yeah, it's very. There's a temptation just to find some so-called left voice in another country that's critical of a leader like Correa or like Lula, and just amplify them and assume, well, because he's from the left, he must be a credible critic, And it's often it's not the case. I mean, sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't, and they're not. Their criticisms aren't necessarily fair. They aren't necessarily sincere. Even when they are sincere, they're not necessarily fair, and sometimes they're not even sincere. There's some opportunistic elements. I mean, anyone who's read Phil Agee's book about the CIA knows how they worked to infiltrate and undermine leftist movements for forever, including Ecuador, right? That's where he was stationed, in Ecuador, for a long time, and then Uruguay. Yeah, so that's something to be very, very cautious about. And we saw this even with Lula, with Evo Morales when he was overthrown. People from putting out these leftist in magazines like Jacobin, putting all sorts of critical articles about him, and he'd just been overthrown in a fascist coup, and they're trying to have it both. They're trying to pretend they're against a fascist coup, but at the same time be hypercritical of the guy who was just overthrown. Yeah, so it's a very unhealthy tendency in the Western left that has to be I don't know, confronted, I would say, and opposed, because it does a lot of damage, I think.
That's a perfect segue to this, which is, can I trouble you to talk about this, because I wanted you to discuss a Twitter back and forth you had with Australian American journalist Caitlin Johnstone, a frequent contributor to Consortium News, and I do like a lot of her commentary, and I do like a lot of her articles, but you both got into excuse me. Yeah, you both got into a discussion about free speech, in which and you had an interesting point of view in which you explained why you're not a free speech absolutist, which other Western leftists, or those who are left-leaning but express or harbor a rather libertarian approach to free speech, which results in them defending Western-backed far-right people determined to overturn left policies and eradicate the left if given half the chance. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, and feel free to expand more. This trap that the Western left gets in their in free speech absolutism.
Yeah, well, it's not just free. I would say, I would even go further. I would say just the whole idea of free speech is just false. There's no such thing as free speech. Speech is never free. I'm not allowed. If you accept that libel laws should exist, if you accept that like tobacco companies should not be allowed that cigarettes cure cancer. I mean, if if you accept any kind of regulation of commercial speech. I mean, everyone's heard of the term the snake oil salesman. You've heard of that, right? Well, that comes from the early 1900s, when there were literally people selling. It wasn't even snake oil. It was actually fake snake oil, because the Chinese immigrants who came to the United States to build the railways, they were brought over as indentured slaves. In China, there is a certain type of snake oil that actually has medicinal properties that they used. They used it as a pain ointment. Imagine the hard labor they were doing, and they used this snake oil as an ointment. So Americans saw that, U.S. hucksters saw that, and they started selling. It was mineral oil, but they sold it as snake oil that cures muscle pain and stuff. And so some people got really rich selling all kinds of products like that, just lying about their products. So even back then, this was doing damage to industry, doing damage to the country. So even under this rugged capitalism of that time, they started to clamp down, and they were not allowed to use the Free Amendment to say, yeah, I can keep going, I can keep saying that this fake snake oil actually will cure you, right? So there's always, and how do you draw the line between what's commercial speech and what's political speech? I mean, ultimately, there's no easy answer for it, right? I mean, it's always a subjective decision, and it's always going to be decided by the courts, by the government of the day. So there's no such thing as free speech. I mean, You see, I mean, where do you draw the line? People always support, well, it's too dangerous to give the government the power because where do you draw the line? Well, they do draw the line. It's always being drawn. So the thing we got to focus on is let's democratize the regulation of speech, but let's not pretend there's easy answers to this because there's not. I mean, let me give you another concrete example. During the Reagan's terrorist war against Nicaragua, I mean, Chomsky did a lot of Noam Chomsky. He opposes libel laws, by the way. That's how free speech he is, okay, which is absurd. But he at the time that Nicaragua was going through this terrorist war against the United States, his position that he wrote, he was wonderful at exposing the hypocrisy of the United States and the brutality. But he still said that Nicaragua should allow La Prensa, this opposition newspaper that he admitted was nothing but a propaganda outlet for a foreign power which was attacking the country. Chomsky still said no. We should still say that they should let that newspaper stay open. So think about that. If a newspaper is helping a foreign power kill people, well, what about the free speech rights of the people they kill? I mean, if you kill somebody, if they're helping to kill people, then obviously they're silencing them as well. I mean, the ultimate way to silence somebody is to kill them. So you take away not only their free speech rights,
and on top of that, but they are engaging in fake news. I mean, it's one thing to have some it's one thing to have somebody like whatever douchebag from the National Burn Toast or Fox News when they their opinions. Obama is a Marxist. We have to oppose him. Hillary Clinton is going to, put this country down to hell. Okay, it's one thing if it's an opinion, but when you have like an active, far right, media, which we might even get into this, that says that Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters are anti-Semitic when it's just BS. It's just people who are criticizing Israel legitimately. It's even Jewish anti-Zionists. So how can they be anti-Semitic? And yet that lie was allowed to spread and spread. Like, I'm not for that kind of free speech. And I would have and when we talk about the issue of climate change, one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to actually do something about climate change, one can argue whether this Green New Deal or even electric vehicles are going to save us. We can have that argument if the science is sound there. But when you actually, but when you're confronting people who read one junk journalism news after another that says that climate change is a complete hoax, are we really for the free speech of that person? Are we really for the free speech of that person? So I want your response on that.
Well, there's two things. One thing leftists are pretty good about is recognizing that the concentrations of wealth and power end up empowering certain oligarchs to basically control speech because they own the newspapers, they own the social media. So for the most part, leftists are pretty good about, well, not always, but pretty much saying those kind of oligarchies, that kind of media control shouldn't exist. The media should be democratized. Unfortunately, I think what they don't always confront is that even if you do democratize media completely, suppose you have a media where nobody really has nobody, there's no Elon Musk, there's no oligarch, everything, there's a government that's elected, more or less has democratic mechanism, more or less representative of the desires of the population. That still, even on that great situation, you still don't get around all sorts of hard questions about what you can allow people to say. You have to weigh the damage they could do to people. Like if I get you killed, how can you say I have the free speech to get you killed? Because why should I be allowed that speech? Because if I'm getting you killed, either by selling a product that's going to kill you, or by inciting racist attacks against you or the group that you belong to, then if I'm putting your life in danger, if I'm imprisoning you with what I'm saying, then I'm silencing you. So how come I'm allowed to silence you that way, right? So it's a dilemma, and I don't think there's an easy answer for it. So I think even if you do democratize speech, you still have to draw lines about what people, you have to weigh the harm that they do against the benefit. Okay, but maybe there's a benefit of allowing, there is a benefit of allowing a wide diversity of views so you can debate things and question things. That's true, but it doesn't mean that you have to allow everything. And there's no easy answer. Well, how do you, Joe? You have to democratically, people have to make that determination. There's no easy answers for it. Like, there's a guy who called me a satanic and parasitic Jew on Twitter. In my opinion, that guy should have been just banned from Twitter and deleted. I don't see why that. How can you justify that's a speech as well as contributing to debate? How? Right? I'm not Jewish, by the way. I'm not trying to I don't want to be accused of falsifying my identity. He was mistaken. He just assumed I was for whatever reason. But I'm just saying that I have no problem with people democratically electing some kind of authorities to regulate speech. I think it's always done anyway. So it should be done democratically. But I don't think I think the kind of free speech positions that Chomsky has sold to the absolute left. Yeah, they call it absolute. There's really no such thing, because I mean, when there's a contradiction there. Like I said, when he's saying La Prensa should keep publishing, even though it's aligned with a foreign power that's killing Nicaraguans, then he is saying that La Prensa has the right to silence Nicaraguans. Because if they're helping the foreign power kill people, well, if you're killing people, you're silencing them. Right? You're depriving them of all their rights, including the right to speech, obviously. So there's a fundamental contradiction there. Okay, there's a fundamental contradiction that cannot be easily dealt with, and even a much more democratic society than ours will still have those dilemmas about where to draw the lines, about what's acceptable, or when speech becomes so toxic and so harmful they have to say no. There's really no reason to allow this. And the other thing is, for who do you allow it? Like. That guy who called me a person, I don't know if he might have been a lady, who knows? On the internet, people can pose as anything. But he called me a satanic and parasitic Jew. Okay, what if we find out that guy, we can prove that the guy who said that or said something like that is a police officer, a teacher, a manager of some kind, right? Should a person in authority get caught using language like that and be allowed to keep their job? I say no. I mean, a person in authority has to be one of the basic requirements of their job is that they're not going to be that their job is not going to be impacted by their racial bigotry. You know, if I'm just driving a truck, if I'm just doing a job that doesn't involve authority, right? But if you're in a job of authority, how can you be allowed that authority? How can you be allowed the job of authority if you've been caught expressing bigotry like that? In my opinion, you should be fired.
Interesting that you say that, because I believe there was a big scandal that happened in Britain with the Met, the Metropolitan Police. A bunch of it was found out that a bunch of police officers were making a lot of racist jokes, sexist jokes, and lots of queerphobic jokes. And I think a lot of them ended up being fired, or certainly discipline. One could argue that, hey, this is in the privacy of their own homes, this of their own iPhones. Not to say, but
if in the privacy,
this is in the privacy of their own homes and whatnot. But as you mentioned, but of course, several months later, there was a huge government report that showed that the police in Britain were institutionally racist, sexist, xenophobic, and queerphobic, and so it's interesting what you were. Yeah.
To me, in my opinion, is straightforward. That a basic requirement of a job is that you have to be somebody who's trustworthy with authority. It's like, why if a police officer gets caught stealing, do you allow him to be a police officer? Or like I talked about Correa's reforms in Ecuador, where they basically hooked them up to a polygraph, saying, would you take a bribe? Have you taken a bribe? Do you know people who've taken bribes? Or so, because the basic requirement of the job is that you can be trusted with the authority. To me, if you're making flagrantly racist remarks about people, you're showing that you're not qualified for the job. To me, it's no different than finding out that the police officer lied on his application, lied about his or about any requirement on his application. You lie about yourself on an application, you're fired. Right? I mean, that's pretty standard. If a job requires a university degree, and I falsify it, well, guess what? I'm fired, because you falsified your your requirements. So if to exercise authority, I would say.
The camera's a bit cutting off your head a bit. Is there a way to? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd argue that if your basic requirement to have a position of authority is that you could be trusted not to abuse your authority because of your racial prejudice. If you're demonstrating racial ethnic prejudice a prejudice of any kind, then you're, to me, in my mind, in my opinion, that should disqualify you from that kind of work. Now, I don't think like, okay, but then say, okay, but who decides? I mean, what standard of proof? What okay, those are all important questions. You know, should be innocent till proven guilty. Yeah, I mean, it should be, it shouldn't be something that's taken lightly. It shouldn't the person have a right to defend themselves. You should be standards of all that good stuff that we always have, right? But still, it shouldn't be like it's impossible to fire somebody if they get caught being blatantly racist as in a position of authority. I think that's a straightforward one. Those are the kind of dilemmas, and again, I don't think those dilemmas go away even if you had a much more democratic society. You're still going to have to face those kind of decisions. So that's where I think this whole free speech slogan that's been thrown around by leftists is actually damaging. And I think if you think about the reason, and I think Adam Johnson had a good piece he wrote about free speech. And he said free speech for leftists, especially in the West, it's often been a convenient slogan because that gets us on the same side as liberals, right? You know, if they come after you for being a communist, you don't defend being a communist. You say, oh, free speech. You know, defend because of free speech, right? You want to go after, McCarthyism. You want to go after that stuff. Free speech becomes this vague banner that you can ally yourself with liberals, right? But then how much does it actually help, and who does it help? You know, because we have these free speech victories all the time for fascists that even Chomsky points to, that the big victories for free speech have been like for the Ku Klux Klan and stuff, right? But I say, really? And who's it helped? I mean, because, you know, decades after the Nicaragua war that you wrote about in the 80s, nobody's held accountable. Nobody, none of the perpetrators in the United States are held accountable. So who did that free speech help? You've had mass incarceration. Doesn't that silence people? So where were all the free speech benefits? You know what I mean? So I'm just saying that we have to think more about free speech. I reject that slogan. I think it actually ultimately does more harm than good. I think it just encourages like kind of a libertarian, like you said, a libertarian thinking, a kind of liberal thinking. And I don't think it's. I think, yeah, diversity of speech, definitely. Tolerance for unpopular views, for controversial views, yes. But never complete. It's never 100%. You always have to weigh the damage that some speech can do to other people.
It's interesting because Abby Martin and her brother Robbie Martin would who have their very popular podcast Media Roots. I remember now I know Abby was against the complete deplatforming and silencing of Alex Jones. Arguments being that if the government and the Silicon Valley folks can do its Alex Jones, it's only going to be sooner or later where they're going to do it to me, to Telesur, to RT, and to anyone that has a left point of view, an anti-imperialist point of view. What would be your response? What would be your response? What would be your response to that?
Well, my response is that they silence people. They silence people. They do silence people. How did they silence Assange, right? How did they silence them? They didn't even have to use free speech laws, or they didn't have to use speech laws at all. They used sexual assault laws, right? You can use sexual assault laws. You can use espionage laws. You can use assault laws. You can use drug laws. There's any number of laws the government will weaponize against people because they don't want to say, oh, we're not going to say we're going after speech. We'll concoct some other excuse. So I don't think, first of all, I think the so-called free speech protections are overblown. I totally agree that it should be that we should say, hey, it shouldn't be that these corporations shouldn't be making those decisions. They're not elected. Say, you know what, the government should just nationalize these companies and let the government take full responsibility. Don't let them outsource it to private sector elites and then just kind of, oh, it's not us. Go talk to Elon Musk. Go talk to whoever the CEO is. No, make them nationalize it. We should say, no, you nationalize it and you own it. You want to censor, you own it. You own your own censorship. Explain why you're doing it. And at first, I don't think we should always say that it's not justified. But that's the point you make too, is that, yeah, the way we protect ourselves is by protecting out the likes of Alex Jones, right? Or like Chomsky said in one of his books, by protecting the KKK, right? So this mentality is that when we stick up for fascists, we're sticking up for leftists. No, Okay, I say we stick up for fascists. We're actually sticking up for fascists, period. Because we just assume the benefits are going to flow back to us. First of all, think about how dishonorable that is, right? And also think about, we're going to defend them so they won't harm us. Instead of saying, look, we're going to defend our views because they're defensible and they're good. We're going to say, we're going to defend terrible people and hope that they go easy on us, right? And I just don't think that's an honorable position. And also it leads, like I also mentioned, if you're going to have a free speech position like that, it also ends up getting weaponized against countries that like Nicaragua or like Venezuela or like Bolivia, where they actually try to control speech so that U.S.-backed police and military don't kill people with the help of the seditionist outlets and that. They try to clamp down on them, and you tell them don't do that because free speech. So you're going to tell them not to defend themselves, right? Because you want to be safer at home, because you don't want to be shut down at home.
And on top of that, as you mentioned, these are countries which are fighting, not just for sovereignty, which is important, but they're fighting against active coup fascists who are using their media organs to whip up people into frenzy to later overthrow said government. And when those thugs get into power, they brutally eradicate the left.
Right. So how do you say it's okay for those governments to take measures to defend themselves? How do you say it's okay for Cuba? Like Fidel Castro said very bluntly, no, we do not allow a party of imperialism to exist. That's perfectly valid. He's a tiny island facing off against a superpower. So how do you defend that? How do you defend? You should. How do you defend that if you're also going to take this free speech position that says protect Alex Jones, if you're gonna end up telling Chomsky's actually, you got to admit, he's closer to being consistent in a way. It used to be. Now I think he's gone off the rails. But he used to say, okay, because Chomsky would say, yeah, keep Alex Jones open, and then he would actually tell Nicaragua keep La Prensa open. But it's ridiculous to tell Nicaragua to keep La Prensa open. It's ridiculous to say that because they're helping the U.S.-backed fascists kill people, and killing people obviously deprives them of all the rights, including the right to speech. So it's not a position that I think is well thought out, and I don't think history of the last 40 years since Reagan's wars validates that position. We haven't, the free speech protections in the United States. What have they done for the victims of U.S. aggression? What have we done to hold them accountable? To hold anybody accountable in the United States and Canada, because Canada's, of course, like this with U.S. imperialism. So what have we done to hold them accountable? This is basically nothing. Nobody's being held accountable. So what good are all these free speech protections that we're having? What is the benefit to people beyond our borders of us sticking up for the likes of Alex Jones or all these other people? I don't think it has any benefit. So I don't agree with that position.
Interesting. We're gonna have to definitely we're gonna have to have a series of conversations about that because it is fascinating, and I think it even challenges my own point of view, which is just allow free speech, and I think so yeah, we're definitely going to have to return back to that, and if anyone's interested, maybe even have organize a debate about that. But then, lastly, the last question I wanted to ask you, which is definitely related to a lot of what we were talking about today, is this. Another brilliant documentary has come out on the Israel lobby, Israel itself, the ultra-Zionists in the UK, the ruling Tory party, the right-wing Labour folks, and the UK deep state and the media across the spectrum in the UK, well, across a very narrow spectrum. It's all right-wing to me, from the BBC, the Guardian, Channel 4, to the openly far-right pro-Tory press in destroying, the Corbyn project. The Big Lie, that's what the documentary is called, and it was banned in Glastonbury, and Paul Mason, the establishment bootlicker and grifter fake leftist Ash Sakar of Navarre Media have pissed on the findings of this of this documentary, which again, debunks the fake anti-Semitism crisis, in which I have to remind people, Jewish anti-Zionists and any leftists who were in solidarity with Palestine and the broad anti-war movement were slandered and and thrown under the bus. But I wanted your thoughts on that. But I also wanted your thoughts on, again, the often overlooked but crucial, important fact that Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and their team threw their own people power movement under the bus. And instead of calling BS to this slander, they said that an anti-Semitism crisis does exist, but it's being dealt with. And I also wanted your response, because these are the same people who are always demanding accountability for other leftist heads of state, and who have thrown Julian Assange under the bus. John McDonnell, he likes to laugh it up with professional liar and war criminal scumbag at large Alistair Campbell, saying that Tony Blair isn't a war criminal. So I wanted your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, well, Corbyn was a weak leader. Corbyn did nothing but Corbyn. He was weak, but then he wasn't that bad. He seemed like he had some backbone, at least from when he was first elected leader in 2015 until 2017. He did surprisingly well in the general election. Came very close to winning and then after that, he basically just fell apart. He just backpedaled more and more. Probably the backpedaling, actually, in terms of votes, the backpedaling on Brexit probably hurt him even more than the backpedaling on the whole anti-Semitism smear campaign. But he was just not interested in fighting back. That's not who he is. He doesn't have those political instincts. So you could, maybe he doesn't have that personality either. But my opinion, you don't even have to have a very hard-nosed personality just to stand up for your basically for your supporters and for your beliefs. But he didn't have either, and he was surrounded by very bad people. I mean, John McDonnell, like you said, sits down with Alistair Campbell, a war criminal, and says that Tony Blair isn't a war criminal, scoffs at the idea that Tony Blair is a war criminal, and Corbyn says absolutely nothing about it. Never denounced that. The whole you mentioned the Navarro people, they basically just made some tepid. One of them, Aaron Bastani, actually initially said the interview was great, where McDonnell said that, and then kind of after he got so much flack, he started throwing in some feeble criticism of it. Just terrible. There's a lot of opportunity. I see them basically just opportunists. I don't see them. I don't even take them seriously as I don't think they even have core beliefs. I think they're just so opportunistic. I think the person who's done the best work to expose them is Asa Winstanley of Electronic Intifada. I'm reading his book. I'm about because I've been reading so many other things on my other stuff that I'm working on. So I've started his book, and it's fantastic. He is just great. So I haven't seen the film yet, but I mean it's amazing. Michael Walker, one of the Navarro people, he criticized the film for using the big lie because apparently they say that Hitler coined that phrase. First of all, I doubt that. He might have popularized it. I doubt. I mean, how likely is that Hitler was really the first person to say big and lie together in a sentence? That's not exactly.
But the fact that he even has a reaction like that, instead of just shutting the beep up and going, "Wow, I can't believe what they did to Corbyn." Instead, he's trying to curry favors with the establishment.
He was trying to equate. Yeah, he was trying to use the title of the film. Say, Hitler said big lie. You put your title of the film. Aha. Like that was your big gotcha. He was saying that was very stupid of them to do. I say no. First of all, if you know anything about Hitler, Hitler was a Western imperialist. Hitler was coddled by the West right up until the war broke out, right until the very last moment, because he was a Western imperialist. He was a vicious anti-communist. His anti-Marxism and his anti-Semitism were totally at one. They're inextricably linked. I I have a review of Mein Kampf. I read Mein Kampf. I did a detailed review of it. So if you know anything about Mein Kampf, you know when it was written, you know the reaction to it, you know that he was a Western imperialist. So even if the film is throwing back the words of a Western imperialist, I mean that's basically what Hitler was about. Hitler was about Western imperialism. Just he had his own take on it for Germany. He wanted to build a super state in Europe. He didn't think it was practical to expand into the colonies out there in the global south until Germany had its own superstate built on the backs mainly of the corpses of the Soviet Union. And again, this was all laid out in Mein Kampf, exactly what he wanted to do. So, I mean, if you're making the title of your film by using the words of a Western imperialist who was supported by other Western imperialists until he became inconvenient for them, first of all, that's not even inappropriate. But the thing with people of that mindset, what they try to do with Hitler, the Western establishment, is they try to depict him as kind of a one-time freak who just kind of appeared out of nowhere. It's like, no, that's what I got from Mein Kampf. This is just a guy, a Western imperialist who brought it home to Europe. So, but he's totally within the tradition, within the mentality of what Western imperialists are. So so that's why they try to exceptionalize him in a way. He was exceptional in some ways in terms of the catastrophe he created, definitely. But the catastrophes, if he had just stuck to creating them like the British did in the rest of the world, then he would not have been demonized the way he is. He would not be seen as the evil person he was, right? So so I think that's part of why people get away with kind of exceptionalizing Hitler in that way and depicting him as something outside of Western imperialism. That's I think at the core of why a guy like Michael Walker is going to just say, "Oh, you used Hitler's language, therefore you're my guy," and being horrified that they used the big lie. That's the title. But that's a whole other thing. But you're right. It's a ridiculous career. It's somebody who obviously does not give a damn about the smear campaign, and they don't. They're happy to collaborate with it, and they're terrible. They're terrible.
As long as they get invited on the BBC, as long as they get their op-eds in the Guardian and so forth, and they get to rub shoulders with Blairites and insincere Corbynistas, all is hunky dory. But that goes to but doesn't that go to show that that despite Western people power movements and Palestine solidarity movements, we still have an uphill battle to do when it comes to not just confronting propaganda, Western media propaganda, but on an issue like Palestine, we still have an uphill battle when it comes to the I'm going to plagiarize Margaret Thatcher, the enemies from within, those who claim to be progressive socialists on everything except Palestine, and or something which is even worse. Well, no, not worse. Something which kind of which expands that pretty messed up mindset, which is I'm for socialist reforms at home, but I'm okay with imperialism overseas. So socialism can be overturned in Venezuela. It could be socialist reforms can be overturned in Brazil. I'm okay with that as long as I have my single-payer health care, my pharmacare, and the 1%ers just don't marginalize me and my working class communities and precarious middle class folk. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and actually that's why my perspective turned against this whole free speech banner that the Western left uses too often, because it's a way of looking out for yourself. You say, okay, I'm going to protect free speech because I think that maintains my platform. Okay, but then if you're doing that, you're using it as, then you end up creating a talking point that's used against actually existing left-wing governments who are actually trying to defend themselves. So that's a dilemma that isn't usually resolved. So what I say is that we should acknowledge that there are genuine dilemmas that don't easily go away with regards to what's acceptable and what's unacceptable to say, and that there's no easy answer to it. And that there is sometimes grounds for disqualifying certain types of speech, and it happens all the time. And we shouldn't pretend that that's not the case, that it isn't the case.
And sometimes, when it comes also to the issue of free speech, I'm not for censoring, the Howard Sterns of the world or the South Parks of the world, but that whole tolerance of, shock jock humor, political correctness has only, I think, pivots the society more and more to the far right and to the reactionary right as well, because we can't speak out on racism, we can't speak out on queerphobia, we can't even speak out on sexism without people going without the reaction amongst people is, oh, you're being too sensitive, and you're being too sensitive, uh, or the ridiculous thing, which I quite find disturbing to see even friends and colleagues of mine do, which is the complaining about too much wokeism and stuff like that. Which anytime I hear people, and it's and a lot of times when I hear people, say like, there's too much wokeism, it's just a dog whistle for it's just a dog whistle to the fact that they're just kind of bigoted bigoted jerks and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What they want to do is they've been doing this long before that term woke was used. It was political correctness was back in the day in the 90s. That was very popular. Political incorrectness then became a thing where basically you're taking views that are reactionary and you're trying to and bring basically bigotry, and you're trying to serve it up as something edgy, and that by doing it you're being brave and you're defending free speech. Free speech. Okay. There's no such thing as free speech, and it's not courageous basically to get on these corporate outlets and just dump on vulnerable people. That's basically what it amounts to, and then try to act like you're the victim if there's a backlash against you. So yeah. So I like I said, there's dilemmas. People need to be able to say things that are unpopular. I mean, don't people need to say things that are unpopular? Don't people need to go against the majority on questions? Isn't that can't? Yeah, that's true, but that doesn't mean that it's a free for all, and that there's no such thing as harm done by bigotry. Like, if I'm not allowed to libel you as a person, I'm not allowed to say you're a thief, right, and go around spreading it, and you're allowed to sue me for damages. Why is it okay for me to libel an entire group? Why is that suddenly acceptable, right? So I think I think there's questions that don't just that democratizing the regulation of speech can help a lot, but I still think there's basically questions that aren't easy to answer, and it's easier when you're not in power, when you can't even envision yourself being in power, taking an absolutist or a very rigid stance against it, because you're not actually having to govern. But the people out there who are trying to govern, they have to confront these issues, and you're not helping if you're spreading these dogmas of so-called free speech, which really never exists anyway. It's a sloppy term. I kind of equate it to the free market. I hate when people say the free market. There's no such thing. There is literally no such thing as a free market. Free market, you need buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers have to own what they buy and sell. They have to have property rights. There's implicit and explicit contracts when you go transactions. All of that doesn't exist without the government. So, the markets are not like rivers and mountains that can exist even if there's no governments in the world. There are still rivers and mountains out there, right? But transactions between people, again, property rights and they don't exist without a government. So there's no such thing as a free market. And I really wish people would stop using that term. Markets can be competitive or not competitive at all, or somewhat competitive, but there's no such thing as free market. And it's something very similar. There's no such thing as free speech. And when people use those terms, free market, free speech, free trade, it just serves to confuse and to mystify things that shouldn't be mystified.
Actually, can I squeeze one more question out of you? Can I ask one more question, actually?
Sure.
Okay, then my final question, as we wrap up, is what would be your response to people who say that if we have if we have state media, Okay. So say, I mean, well, we do. I mean, we do have state media. We have the CBC. We have the BBC. Holland has its versions. France has its versions. Germany has. I mean, there's state media, everywhere, and I think it is important to have independent media in which an oligarch is not breathing down your neck, and not one particular, government of whichever faction of a plutocracy is not dictating to you on what you can cover, what scandals you can do, and so forth like that. But how do you respond to there's this person, the guy who hosts Counterpunch Radio, Eric Dratester, who's I mean, he's a big advocate of media has to be entirely independent, because press TV is all because press TV, that's just pushing the the Iranian government state line. RT is subtly pushing reactionary views of Russia, and is advocating reactionary views of Russia's foreign policy. And a lot of people also said the exact same thing about Telesur, that there's a conflict of interest, because of course Telesur is going to be defending Maduro or this left-wing government head of state, but look at what that left-wing government is doing in their with climate change, and look how that left-wing government is suppressing such and such a popular movement. So I'm so I yeah, so I'm just curious. Yeah, I'm just curious. How can we envision, a state media where there isn't, a government that only wants to show us the good, and not, some of the deficiencies that may exist hypothetically in a Maduro government, in a Ortega government, or any left-wing government that comes to
Well, any
the
real world government, any real world government, there's deficiencies, injustice. I mean, governments are by nature imperfect, so there are always deficiencies. As for state media, I would say there's mechanisms. I mean, yeah, there's a concern. State media, how do you know it's independent of the government of the day? I would say the way to address that would be by electing the people who run state media directly, as opposed to having them appointed by the government. Have them directly elected or chosen by lot, by juries, like juries are. I mean, if you want your, I mean, what do you want to do? If you want your city government not to be necessarily directly independent of your national government, well, you have local elections, right? So if you want an institution to be independent of another, you have separate elections for that institution, but you can still have it democratically run, right? As far as independent media, I always like the idea that Dean Baker and Robert McChesney have pointed out, where the government issues vouchers to people for media, and it could also be for art and stuff, that basically you own a piece of the budget. They say, here's a piece of the budget that you own. You can give this to any outlet that you like, as long as it's not, in the proposal they have, it's like, as long as it doesn't have copyright protection, it's not commercial. There's different, but basically otherwise it's pretty wide open. So that's another way to stimulate independent media that's not directly run by the government. So there's mechanisms you can do to democratize either traditional state media or more independent media, to make sure there's diversity, and that there's adequate funding, and people can live, make a decent wage actually doing media or art or whatever. So there's ways to do it. But also, I mean, in real world, I mean, in governments like Ecuador and Venezuela, there's already established an oligarch's media. So when a progressive government takes over, what do they have to use state media to counter that? So that's but I think, yeah, sometimes they could be more imaginative and going further than that. But it's not easy. It takes resources, and they have all sorts of other problems to deal with at the same time, including just not being overthrown. So it's it's a challenge.
Exactly, and also and also, as the Western left has proven, sometimes even just nonprofit indie media does not mean that we're not that we're not immune to recycling propaganda, as this show has covered many times. NGOs or semi-NGOs I mean, oftentimes are just working, just work hand in hand, marching to the beat of of imperialism. If the Intercept has shown that anything that's supposedly nonprofit independent media was was in the hands of the was in the hands of an oligarch. So,
yeah.
Anywho, but I think that's a very good place to end. And these are conversations that we definitely have to return to in the future because they're fascinating, and I find that not enough of the Western left actually even really engages critically when it comes to the issues of free speech and stuff like that. So thank you very much for thank you very much for coming on the program to do that. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Joe Emersberger, a media critic, NGO critic, leftist activist, and anti-imperialist voice, frequent contributor to Zednet and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. He's also the co-author with Justin Pujor on Extraordinary Threat, which is all about 20 years of of coup attempts and propaganda against Venezuela. Joe, thank you so much for coming on the program, and I look forward to having you back on. And and until then, have a very great afternoon. Very great evening.
I better run. Thank you.